New York City reverting to its 1970 glory days of drug use and prostitution. Similarly, you had stagflation at that time, and we have stagflation again now. And you had, back in the 60s, a collapse of what was known as the Nifty 50 on Wall Street. Stock market went into a swoon in the 70s, which caused economic mayhem. We've got a stock market right now which is trading near all-time highs. What's missing would be a stock market collapse of 40 or 50% to really put the cherry on the pie here. I think we got something brewing on that front.
I mean, that's the interesting thing is, again, Max and I remember the 70s. We remember the 70s in New York. We remember this sort of look of the 70s of a lot of high murder rate or rising murder rate, a sort of sense of chaos and all things allowed in the streets. Obviously, it's not as bad, the murder rate and all that stuff there in Manhattan. But one thing that is very different from then is we did have that high inflation, but there was no such thing as stimulus checks and these trillions of dollars being poured into the economy. That did not happen at all. And in fact, while the Fed, bails out everything and any entity, the mortgage security, backed securities, all the whole market, they're bailing out. At that time, back in the 70s, remember New York went bust, i.e. the federal government to New York said, drop dead. So now there's no such thing as that. That mentality is not around at all.
No, we had organized labor back then. We had a wage price increase, and labor had real power back in the 70s. This is before Reagan came into office and Margaret Thatcher, of course, and they crushed labor on both sides of the Atlantic. And that was something that people forget, is that actually the quality of life in the 70s for workers was at the highest it had been for quite some time. Wall Street was suffering, but Wall Street figured out how to crush the workers with financial engineering. And now we've got a situation where the Wall Street can pretty much run the show and just continue to aggregate huge wealth. And workers are continuing to suffer at a precipitous rate.
Well, to be fair, the United States at that time, the elite, the world needed the U.S. worker because the U.S. worker manufactured all the cars, manufactured all the goods and services. They're the ones that we were the big export nation at the time. Since WTO, since Bill Clinton, since Joe Biden was senator, we basically exported all our jobs to China. That was, as we've covered, part of the Triffin dilemma. Now, there's another thing that's completely changed, and this is the Guardian newspaper, like allegedly very left wing. Why does inflation worry the right so much? In other words, yes, prices are up, but so are wages. And depending on what you consume and how much debt you carry, that can be a net positive since inflation erodes the real value of debt. Yeah, finance has had such a hard time these past decade or two, right? There's no profits there, and they would totally hate this inflation, right? Well, even the Fed just reported that in June, wages in the United States in real terms are down about 0.5%.
That's a fundamental point that is overlooked or misstated by the Guardian article, is that real wages are actually down. The right is not concerned about inflation. It's pointing out that we have inflation. And the right is a huge beneficiary of that asset price inflation. As you've been pointing out, that's how the right's been able to double and triple their net worth over this pandemic of COVID. So that's also a misstatement by the author. Number three, it's easy to tell whether or not the ravages of money printing is hitting the American economy by simply looking at the US dollar. So the US dollar, because of its strength at the moment, it shows that it's the cleanest shirt in the laundry. The other currencies around the world are in free-for-all. The ECB and other various currencies, the euro, and there's open rioting and revolt in Europe and in South Africa, and Germany is underwater, and these countries are genuinely facing existential crisis. So the dollar is a beneficiary of that relative to, but that's always been the case in this post-1971 era of fiat money, where everything is relative. And on a relative basis, the US dollar is up compared to these other currencies. But I think that the average worker is experiencing two things: rising prices and a decline in real wages. And that is a recipe for social unrest, which is on the periphery happening in the US. It hasn't yet met the vortex of, like, say, an American Spring, or what's happening in Greece, for example, or Cuba. It hasn't yet happened in the US. We'll see. It looks like it's heading to that, to complete the global insurrection against banker occupation. There are straws in the wind.
Yeah, there is a bit of unrest, you might say, in Cuba. Also in Greece, there were some resistance to some pandemic measures, but certainly for price inflation in terms of food, you're seeing unrest in places like South Africa, like Lebanon, like Haiti, places where a 17% rise in food prices causes a lot of actual harm to their ability to eat. Why doesn't inflation worry the left so much? Because think of, when you look at America, you think of the left really in San Francisco and Los Angeles, right? And they shape our culture, social media and Hollywood media, right? They're the ones that get their message out large. So what do you see there? What's one thing you think of when you think of San Francisco or Los Angeles? Mass homelessness, right? Well, I'm going to look at why the inflation should concern the left based on a headline from 2018, and consider that US house prices are up over 25% at the moment in the past year. So from 2018, high cost of housing drives up homeless rates. UCLA study indicates sky-high housing costs are a significant factor behind California's homeless crisis. In a study contained in the latest UCLA Anderson forecast released Wednesday, this is 3 years ago, UCLA found that higher median rent and home prices are strongly correlated with more people living on the streets or in shelters. The research backs other studies that have found a similar relationship. Being homeless is absolute human suffering, indignity, a crime against humanity, essentially. And that's left-wing inflation that they love.
The Guardian writer, they're cherry-picking information. They're saying they're looking at one set of data which shows that wages are, on a percent basis, up. And they're making a conclusion that, well, why shouldn't the left be happy about this because wages are up? So they refuse to simply add context to that number and say, okay, wages are up this much, but inflation's up more, so your adjusted quality of life is down.